At 69 years old, Helen Vance woke shivering in her freezing car. She had been legally exiled from the very life she built, but what her ex-husband didn't know was that a forgotten plot of land held his complete undoing. Inside a Cold War bunker her father built, true justice waited in the dark. If you have ever watched someone take credit for your quiet labor, listen closely. If you have been discarded by the children you raised, stay right here. If you have ever been left with nothing but the truth, this story is for you. Subscribe now to see what Helen found. What waited beneath that rusted steel hatch proves that genuine justice never misses its mark. Helen sat in the freezing sedan and watched the frost thicken on the glass. The sun had not yet risen over the gas station roof. She rubbed her calloused hands together to generate heat, her breath plumed white in the damp morning air. The steering wheel felt like a block of solid ice. She reached into the pocket of her heavy navy wool coat. Her fingers found the cold metal of a heavy brass compass. It hung on a braided leather cord. Her father gave it to her 40 years ago. It was the only piece of her family line she had left. Everything else belonged to Richard now. She remembered the exact weight of her textbooks. She had been 3 credits away from her architectural degree. Richard told her they could not afford to hire a draftsman. He asked her to design his first commercial building. She closed her textbooks that night and never opened them again. She drafted every line of his first 12 buildings by hand. For 38 years, she ran the billing department for his firm. She sat at a cramped desk in the hallway. She managed every invoice and never drew a salary. When his son broke his arm, Helen drove him to the hospital. She sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. Richard was at a networking dinner and could not be reached. When his daughter caught pneumonia, Helen stayed awake for 7 nights. She cooled the girl's forehead with damp cloths. She attended every parent-teacher conference for over a decade. She cooked the meals, cleaned the house, and drafted the plans. She built the foundation of his entire empire with her own hands. 2 days ago, she sat in a sterile legal office downtown. The room smelled of expensive coffee and polished leather. Richard sat across the long mahogany table. He wore a custom navy suit. His lead attorney placed a thick stack of papers in front of Helen. It was a restraining order built on fabricated claims of mental instability. It legally barred her from the house she had designed herself. It barred her from the corporate office she helped build. Richard adjusted his gold tie clip while the attorney read the terms. "We're worried about you, Helen," Richard said. His voice was perfectly measured and calm. He did not look into her eyes. He looked at the silver pen resting in his hand. "At your age, you can't manage alone," he added softly. "This is what's best for everyone." His daughter sat next to him in a designer winter coat. This was the same daughter Helen had nursed through pneumonia. The young woman spent the entire meeting scrolling through her phone. She tapped the screen rapidly, completely detached from the room. She only looked up once. The attorney asked for her signature as a witness to the eviction. She signed the paper without reading it and returned to her screen. Helen held the brass compass tight in her palm. The heavy metal warmed slowly against her skin. The needle pointed steadily north through the glass. The restraining order meant she could not return to pack a suitcase. She had left with only the clothes she was wearing. She could not access the joint bank accounts she had managed for decades. The legal maneuver was swift, polished, and absolute. She was a trespasser in her own life. She watched a delivery truck pull into the rural gas station lot. The driver stepped out and stretched his arms. Helen had parked behind the garage to avoid the main road. The heavy wool of her coat did little against the biting cold. Her canvas trousers were stiff with the overnight chill. She looked down at her weathered leather boots. These were the boots she wore when walking muddy construction sites with Richard. Now they were the only shoes she owned. Richard had pushed one single thin folder toward her at the meeting. "It's a clean break, Helen. This is fair," he had said smoothly. The folder contained the deed to 5 acres of unwanted woodland. Her father had left her the plot decades ago. Richard always called it a worthless patch of dirt. He kept the $8.7 million estate. He kept the company, the cars, and the bank accounts. He gave her a plot of land with no water and no power. But Richard had forgotten about the bunker. Helen uncurled her fingers and looked at the compass face again. Her father built something on that worthless patch of dirt. He built it during the height of the Cold War. He mixed the concrete himself and welded the steel hatch. He built it to last through the end of the world. Helen put the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally caught. She put the car in gear and drove toward the woods. Helen Vance, exactly 69 years old, gripped the freezing steering wheel of her sedan. The tires hummed against the cracked asphalt of the county highway. She reached up and felt the heavy brass compass resting against her collarbone. The braided leather cord was soft, from decades of wear against her skin. Her father had placed it in her hands on her 12th birthday. He had shown her how the needle always found its way back to center. He told her a compass only works if you trust it to find true north. It was the only physical piece of her bloodline she still carried. The man she had trusted for 38 years had systematically erased everything else. Helen thought about the sheer scale of those 38 years as she drove. When she first met Richard, he was standing in the rain outside a downtown bank. He held a rolled-up set of generic blueprints to his chest. He wore a suit that was too large, and shoes with thin, worn soles. He had just been denied his third commercial construction loan. Helen had bought him a cup of black diner coffee at the corner restaurant. She took his generic blueprints and spread them out on the sticky diner table. She picked up a pen and showed him exactly why the foundation loads were mathematically unsound. She had been 3 credits away from securing her own architectural license at the university. Richard had looked at her with water dripping from his chin onto the paper. He placed his hand over hers. He told her he could change the skyline of the city if he just had a partner. She believed the absolute vulnerability in his eyes that afternoon. She cancelled her final university classes the very next morning. She packed up her drafting table and moved it into his unheated garage. She spent 6 weeks redrafting his entire commercial proposal by hand. She used her own meager savings to buy the drafting vellum, the T-squares, and the graphite. The bank approved the new blueprints immediately upon submission. Richard put his name on the bottom right corner of every single page. Helen had watched him sign the documents and felt only pride for his success. For the next 38 years, she ran the billing department of Vance Development. She set up a small metal desk in the hallway outside his expansive main office. She processed every invoice, balanced every ledger, and filed every quarterly tax return. She never asked for a salary because he said they were building their shared future. When he brought 2 young children from his previous marriage into their home, she raised them. She drove his son to hockey practice every Tuesday and Thursday, in the dark. She packed his daughter's lunches and spent 3 days sewing her costume for the school play. When the son broke his arm falling from a tree, Helen sat in the emergency room for 6 hours. Richard was at a networking dinner, and his phone went straight to voicemail. When the daughter caught pneumonia, Helen stayed awake for 7 straight nights in a wooden chair. She cooled the girl's forehead with damp cloths while Richard slept in the guest room. Helen attended every parent-teacher conference, every middle school graduation, and every piano recital. She cooked the meals, cleaned the sprawling house, and drafted the plans for the next office building. She built the foundation of his entire multi-million-dollar empire with her own hands. She never asked for a title or a share of the equity or public recognition. She believed that love and loyalty were solid structures that would withstand any storm. Before the legal papers arrived, her days had possessed a quiet, steady rhythm. She had drafted the blueprints for their massive estate herself. She had spent 3 months perfecting the angle of the roof to catch the morning sun. She had sourced the reclaimed oak for the hardwood floors. She would wake at 5 in the morning to brew a pot of dark roast coffee. She would sit at her drafting table in the sunroom to review the weekly site plans. She would leave a hot breakfast on the stove for Richard before he woke. She would walk around the perimeter of the property and prune the rose bushes she had planted. She would spend the afternoon approving vendor payments from her cramped hallway desk. She would end the day wiping down the kitchen counters and turning off the lights. She was the invisible engine running a machine that everyone else in the city admired. Now, she was driving away from that machine with absolutely nothing to show for it. She pressed her thumb against the thick glass face of the brass compass. The needle pointed steadily north, completely unaffected by the bitter cold or the motion of the car. Her father had always told her that true north never shifted, no matter the weather. Richard had shifted. His children had shifted. The legal system had shifted to accommodate the man with the most money and the best lawyers. But the heavy brass compass remained exactly the same. Helen pressed harder on the accelerator pedal. The dark pine trees blurred past the frost-covered windows of the sedan. She was a woman driving into the deep woods with a heavy coat and a clear mind. 2 days earlier, Helen had walked into the downtown legal office expecting a standard quarterly tax review. She had taken the brass-lined elevator to the 42nd floor. She had drafted the structural steel supports for this exact elevator shaft 30 years ago. She walked into the main conference room, holding her faded canvas tote bag. Morning sunlight cut through the expensive horizontal blinds in sharp, blinding strips. The bright light illuminated the dust motes floating above the long mahogany table. Richard was already seated at the far end of the massive room. He wore a custom navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a gold tie clip. His lead attorney sat beside him with 3 thick stacks of legal documents. Richard's 2 adult children, David and Sarah, sat on the opposite side. Helen sat down slowly in a black leather chair that was entirely too large for her. She kept her heavy navy wool coat on. The room was kept at a perfectly climate-controlled 68 degrees. Helen felt a sudden, sharp cold settle deep into her chest. The attorney began reading from the first stack of thick white paper. It was not a routine tax review. It was a highly coordinated petition for absolute control of Vance development. The petition cited Helen's alleged mental decline and erratic behavior over the past year. It was a complete fabrication built on forged medical evaluations and purchased testimonies. When the attorney read the words immediate physical removal, Helen felt the air leave the room. She looked at the polished wood grain of the table. She traced the natural lines in the dark mahogany with her eyes. She remembered sourcing similar wood for their dining room table 20 years ago. She had sanded that table herself, while Richard took clients out for expensive dinners. Now, a different wooden table was the site of her total erasure. Helen reached into her coat pocket and gripped the heavy brass compass. The cold metal dug sharply into the deep calluses on her palm. Her thumb rubbed the smooth glass face of the instrument. She felt the braided leather cord slip slowly between her fingers. The brass was heavy and grounded her in the physical reality of the room. She focused on the steady pressure of the metal against her skin. It kept her from disappearing into the absolute shock of the moment. The attorney read a clause stating Helen was immediately locked out of the primary residence. David picked up a crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip. He wiped the condensation from his fingers, using a thick white linen napkin. He tapped a message out on his phone, completely detached from the devastation across the table. Sarah spent the entire reading inspecting her expensive manicured fingernails. These were the children Helen had raised, fed, and nursed through countless childhood illnesses. Neither of them made eye contact with her for the entire 60-minute meeting. Richard steepled his fingers together, resting them on the polished mahogany. "We're worried about you, Helen," he said in a smooth, practiced tone. "At your age, you can't manage a transition like this alone." He leaned forward slightly, adopting a mask of deep, paternal concern. "We're not being cruel, we're being practical." The attorney slid the fabricated restraining order across the wide table. The heavy paper stopped exactly 2 inches from Helen's right hand. "You should have been more financially responsible, Helen," Richard added softly. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." He said this directly to the woman who had managed his corporate ledgers for 38 years. He said this to the woman who had never drawn a single salary to ensure his company survived. The attorney pushed a second document forward across the glass. It outlined the complete dissolution of their shared assets, the $80.7 million estate to Richard, the corporate bank accounts to Richard, the commercial property portfolio to Richard. While David and Sarah exchanged victorious glances across the mahogany table, already planning how to divide the remaining corporate shares, Helen received what they called a clean break, a single thin folder containing the deed to 5 acres of unwanted woodland. The folder contained exactly 1 single sheet of paper. It was the original deed her father had signed over to her before he died. It detailed the coordinates of the 5-acre plot in the deep northern woods. Richard had always mocked the property as a useless hole in the ground. He had refused to pay the minimal property taxes on it for a decade. Helen had paid those taxes in secret, using the meager change she saved from grocery runs. Now, it was the only piece of the earth she was legally allowed to stand on. Helen looked down at the thin manila folder resting on the polished wood. She did not cry. She did not slam her hands against the table or shout at the universe. Her hands trembled slightly, but she pressed them flat against the cold mahogany to steady them. She looked directly at Richard. She looked at the man she had pulled from the edge of absolute financial ruin. "I drafted the blueprints for the floor you are sitting on," Helen said softly. Richard adjusted his gold tie clip and looked down at his expensive silver pen. He did not answer. Helen stood up slowly from the oversized leather chair. She picked up the thin folder containing the deed to the bunker property. She did not look at David or Sarah. She turned and walked across the thick grey carpet toward the glass exit. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. Helen sat in the driver's seat of her idling sedan behind the rural gas station. The heater blew a weak stream of lukewarm air against her frozen hands. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache from sleeping across the center console. Her swollen knees pressed tightly against the steering column. The joints in her fingers were stiff and burned with cold. She reached into the center cup holder and pulled out a small handful of crumpled bills. She smoothed them flat against the worn fabric of her canvas trousers. She counted a 20, a 10, a 5, and 6 damp $1 bills. She reached into the bottom of her faded canvas tote bag and gathered the loose coins. She arranged the quarters, dimes, and pennies in a neat row on the passenger seat. She counted the silver and copper pieces twice to be absolutely sure. She had exactly $41.16 left in the world. She stared at the small pile of metal and paper. She picked up her phone from the cracked dashboard. The screen was shattered in the bottom left corner. She unlocked the device and opened her messages. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from David. There were no text messages from Sarah. The missed calls counter read 0. The email inbox showed 0 new messages. The only notification was an automated calendar reminder for a dental cleaning. She could no longer afford to fill a cavity or buy a tube of toothpaste. She stared at the blank screen for a long time. She waited for a single word from the family she had built from nothing. The screen timed out and faded to black. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat, beside the loose coins. The silence inside the car was absolute. A sudden scratching sound broke the quiet. Helen looked across the empty passenger seat toward the window. A large, scruffy dog with matted brown fur stood in the freezing mud. One of its ears was torn and healed over with thick scar tissue. It pressed a wet, black nose against the frosted glass of her door. The dog sat down on the frozen asphalt and stared directly at her. It shivered violently in the winter wind but did not break eye contact. Helen reached out and pressed her hand against the inside of the cold window. The dog whined once and placed its heavy paw against the glass directly over her hand. It was entirely alone. Helen understood exactly what it meant to be locked out in the cold. She reached into her heavy navy wool coat. Her stiff fingers found the heavy brass compass resting on its braided leather cord. This was the second time she had touched it since the legal meeting. She pulled it out and let it hang from her fingers over the steering wheel. The brass caught the first weak rays of morning light breaking over the gas station roof. The heavy metal grounded her in the physical reality of the freezing car. The needle swung back and forth before settling perfectly north. North was the deep woods. North was the forgotten plot of land. North was the Cold War bunker her father had built. She could drive south to the city and find a women's shelter. She could sleep on a cot surrounded by strangers and fill out government forms. She could become another displaced statistic in the city she helped build. But her father had mixed the concrete for the bunker himself. He had welded the heavy steel hatch with his own hands. He had told her it was built to survive the absolute end of the world. Her world had just ended. She looked at the dog waiting patiently in the freezing mud. The dog wagged its tail once, a slow and deliberate movement. Helen reached across the center console and pushed the passenger door open. "Get in," Helen said. The dog scrambled onto the seat and curled up immediately on the floorboard. It rested its heavy head against her weathered leather boots. Helen put the car in gear. She turned the steering wheel north and pulled out onto the empty county highway. She did not look back. Before leaving the rural gas station, Helen needed to ask for directions. She stepped out of her freezing sedan and walked toward the small building. The station sat on the edge of a forgotten logging town. Next to the pumps stood a general store with a faded canvas awning. A small diner attached to the side had red checkered curtains in the windows. A white church with a modest wooden steeple sat directly across the cracked street. Helen pushed the heavy glass door of the station open. A small silver bell chimed sharply in the quiet room. An older man stood behind the wooden counter. He wore a faded blue mechanic's shirt with the name Marcus embroidered on the pocket. His hands were deeply stained with dark motor oil. He was wiping a heavy wrench with a clean red rag. He looked up and saw Helen shivering in her heavy navy wool coat. He did not ask why she was sleeping in her car behind his garage. He did not ask why she looked so exhausted. He set the wrench down and poured a cup of hot black coffee. He slid the white ceramic mug across the counter toward her. He pushed a small plate with a warm blueberry muffin next to it. "On the house," Marcus said quietly. He looked closely at the braided leather cord visible at her collar. He saw the heavy brass compass resting against her chest. "You must be Arthur's daughter," Marcus said. Helen stopped with her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. She had not heard her father's name spoken aloud in over 20 years. "We've been waiting for you," Marcus told her. "Your father used to talk about you every time he came through here." Marcus pointed out the front window toward the distant, tree-covered ridge. "He always said you would come back when the time was right." Helen felt a sudden tightness in her throat. She drank the hot coffee and ate the muffin in absolute silence. She thanked him, turned, and walked back out to her car. The scruffy dog was waiting patiently on the passenger floorboard. Helen drove 3 miles up a steep, unpaved logging road. The tires spun on the wet gravel before finally gripping the dirt. She parked the sedan when the road ended abruptly at a washed-out ravine. She turned off the ignition and stepped out into the biting wind. The woods were entirely silent. Richard had always called this land a useless patch of dirt. The reality of the terrain was significantly worse. There was no path, no clearing, and no visible structure of any kind. Thick, thorny vines wrapped tightly around the trunks of massive dead oak trees. The ground was completely covered in a thick layer of rotting grey leaves. It looked like a landscape designed to swallow things and keep them hidden. Helen pulled her heavy coat tightly against her throat. The dog jumped out of the passenger side and hit the wet ground. It did not hesitate or look back. The dog pushed forward through a thick wall of dead blackberry bushes. Helen followed the sound of snapping branches deep into the dense woods. Her weathered leather boots slipped constantly on the wet, freezing mud. Thorns tore at the tough canvas of her trousers. Her breath came in short, painful white clouds. She walked until her legs trembled and her lungs burned with the cold. She stopped and leaned her shoulder heavily against a large pine tree. She looked around the identical rows of grey trunks. She was entirely lost on her own property. Then she heard a low, persistent whine. She pushed her way through a final row of heavy brush. The dog was sitting perfectly still beside a large mound of earth. It stared intently at a tangle of thick ivy and refused to move. Helen knelt down in the freezing mud right beside the animal. She reached out with her bare, calloused hands and grabbed the dead vines. She pulled backward with all her remaining strength. The thick ivy tore away and revealed a massive slab of flat concrete. In the exact center of the concrete was a heavy square steel hatch. It was entirely coated in thick, layered dark orange rust. The edges were sealed completely shut by decades of compacted earth and moss. It looked impossible for a woman her age to open. Helen looked at her raw, bleeding knuckles. She thought about turning back and walking to the safety of the car. Then she saw a small detail beneath the dirt. Near the heavy iron hinges, 2 small letters were perfectly welded into the steel. A. V. Arthur Vance. Her father had left his mark exactly where she would find it. Helen scraped the packed dirt away from the heavy, circular iron locking wheel. She gripped the frozen metal securely with both of her hands. She planted her boots firmly on the concrete slab. She pulled backward using her entire body weight. The metal groaned loudly against the silent woods. She pulled again, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up her lower back. A loud crack echoed through the trees as the heavy rust seal finally broke. The massive steel hatch swung upward on its hinges. A sudden rush of stale, perfectly dry air blew up from the darkness. The dog wagged its tail once. The door was open. The heavy steel hatch remained open against the damp earth. Helen descended the steep iron ladder into the absolute dark. Her swollen knees popped sharply with every metal rung. The air inside the bunker was bone-chilling and smelled of dry concrete. She struck a single match from her coat pocket. The small flame illuminated a 10 by 10-foot square room. The walls were solid grey stone and thick steel reinforcement beams. There was no heat, no running water, and no electricity. She gathered dry pine boughs from the woods to make a bed. She spread her thin canvas tote bag over the prickly needles. The dog curled into a tight ball beside her legs for warmth. The first 3 days broke her down physically. Her lower back throbbed constantly from sleeping on the concrete floor. Her knuckles bled from breaking dead branches for a small surface fire. She collected rainwater in a rusted metal bucket she found in the corner. She established a strict daily routine to keep herself moving. She woke at dawn, and cleared wet leaves from the main ventilation pipe. She hauled heavy buckets of water from a nearby runoff stream. She walked the perimeter of the property to gather usable firewood. On the fourth afternoon, she heard heavy boots crunching on the gravel above. Helen climbed the iron ladder and looked out of the hatch. Marcus stood in the clearing holding a folded blue plastic tarp. He carried a heavy steel thermos and a small box of dry matches. He did not ask how she was surviving in the freezing dark. He handed her the supplies and set the thermos on the concrete ledge. "I had extra in the garage," Marcus said. He turned and walked back through the woods without waiting for a thank you. That night, a brutal winter storm hit the mountain ridge. Freezing rain hammered against the exposed steel hatch. Ice water began dripping steadily through the aging rubber seals. Helen sat in the pitch black as puddles formed on the concrete floor. The damp cold seeped directly into her bones. Her hands ached so badly she could barely close her fingers. She pulled her shattered phone from her heavy navy wool coat. The battery showed 4%. There was no cellular service. There were 0 messages from David or Sarah. The screen illuminated her exhausted face in the dark room. Helen pulled her knees to her chest and shivered uncontrollably. She thought, "I cannot survive a winter in a damp concrete hole. I am 69 years old with $41.16. My hands are failing and I cannot stop the freezing water. This is where I die. This is what dying alone looks like." She closed her eyes and waited for the cold to take her. The dog nudged her cold hand with its wet nose. Hours passed in the freezing darkness. Morning finally broke over the tree line. A single, sharp beam of sunlight pierced a tiny crack in the hatch seal. The light struck the heavy brass compass, resting on her chest. The metal glowed a brilliant, impossible gold in the grey room. The compass needle pointed steadily north, completely unbothered by the storm. Helen stared at the gleaming brass instrument her father had built. She felt a sudden, sharp heat rise in her chest. She refused to accept what had been done to her. She stood up from the wet concrete floor. She looked at the puddle of freezing water spreading toward her boots. "I am not dying in a hole he called worthless," Helen said aloud. "I am 69 years old, and I still matter." She grabbed the rusted bucket and began bailing the water. Helen finished bailing the freezing rainwater from the bunker floor. She noticed the water had pooled unnaturally against the far northern wall. The scruffy dog stood by the damp concrete and scratched at the baseboard. It whined and dug its thick claws into a seam near the floor. Helen knelt in the remaining shallow puddle. She ran her bare fingers along the bottom edge of the grey wall. The concrete was not a single poured slab. There was a distinct, straight horizontal crack running exactly 3 feet long. It was a false panel perfectly disguised in the dark. Decades of calcium buildup and hard water had sealed the narrow gap shut. Helen reached for the heavy brass compass resting against her chest. She gripped the solid metal edge. She wedged the thick brass casing into the hardened crack. She used her father's instrument to scrape the stone seal away. The heavy compass chipped through the white calcium in thick flakes. The false concrete panel suddenly shifted forward. Helen grabbed the rough edge and pulled the heavy block free. A deep, dry cavity was set directly into the earth behind the wall. Inside the hole sat a dark green steel military lockbox. It was wrapped in thick layers of waterproof canvas. Helen pulled the heavy metal box onto the damp floor. Her hands began to tremble violently. Her chest tightened so severely she could not draw a full breath. She unclasped the twin brass latches on the front of the box. The lid opened with a sharp hiss of preserved air. Inside lay perfectly dry stacks of manila folders and bound ledgers. Helen picked up the first piece of paper. She stared at the thick black ink. She read the top line, but the words did not make sense. She saw the date printed at the top. It was exactly 38 years ago. It was the exact month Richard had secured his first massive commercial loan. She set the paper down and picked it up again. She read the second paragraph very slowly. The ink detailed a massive transfer of seed capital. The money had not come from the downtown bank. The money had come from a private trust established by Arthur Vance. Helen stopped breathing entirely. She opened the next folder with shaking fingers. She pulled out the original foundational corporate deeds for Vance Development. Richard's signature was nowhere on the founding documents. Every single original deed was legally registered strictly in Helen's name. Richard had hidden the true funding source for nearly 4 decades. He had built a complex labyrinth of offshore accounts to bury the paper trail. He had forged the subsequent ownership records to legally erase her. He had stolen the empire she built with money her father had secretly provided. The bunker did not just hold the truth, it held the absolute, unaltered legal proof of massive corporate fraud. Helen lowered the papers to her lap. She looked at the brass compass resting beside the steel box. "You knew he would try to take it," Helen whispered to the empty room. The dog rested its chin heavily on her knee. She read the papers a third time. That was when everything changed. Helen did not leave the woods with the legal documents. She placed the heavy steel lockbox back into the dry concrete cavity. She slid the false stone panel perfectly back into place against the wall. She needed a secure place to prepare for what came next. She needed to transform the freezing damp hole into a fortress. The bunker was still a cold, leaking square of raw concrete. The air smelled of 50 years of trapped moisture and rotting leaves. She started with the rusted iron ventilation pipe leading to the surface. She climbed the steep iron ladder, holding a stiff wire brush. She spent 3 full days scraping decades of compacted dirt from the heavy mesh screen. Her knuckles bled freely onto the tough canvas of her trousers. Her lower back ached with a sharp, burning intensity. She ignored the pain and kept scrubbing the rusted metal grate. On the 4th afternoon, clean air finally pulled steadily down into the underground room. Next, she needed heat to dry the weeping concrete walls. She walked 3 miles down the dirt road to the rural gas station. She carried a flawless architectural layout she had drawn on the back of a receipt. She handed the paper across the counter to the old mechanic. She told Marcus she could draft the permit plans for his planned garage expansion. She asked for a discarded cast-iron wood stove sitting behind his shop in return. Marcus loaded the heavy black stove into the back of his pickup truck. He drove it up the muddy logging road and helped her lower it down the hatch. He brought 3 sections of galvanized steel stovepipe. Helen connected the metal pipe directly into her father's cleared ventilation shaft. She built a small fire using dry pine branches and thick bark. The heavy iron stove drafted perfectly in the enclosed space. Thick grey smoke pulled straight up the chimney and out of the bunker. Radiant heat pushed the deep dampness out of the grey concrete walls. She spent the next 3 weeks gathering discarded materials from the woods. She found an abandoned logging camp 2 miles east of her property. She used her father's heavy brass compass to navigate back and forth through the dense trees. She salvaged wide planks of rough-hewn cedar from a collapsed drying shed. She carried the heavy boards back to the bunker one by one. The wood cut deep red lines into her tired shoulders. Her weathered leather boots wore down at the heels from the rocky terrain. She laid the cedar planks carefully across the cold concrete floor. She used rusted square nails she pulled from the ruined camp. She drove them into the floor joists using a heavy, flat river stone. She built a sturdy, elevated wooden bed frame against the back wall. She stacked flat rocks around the cast-iron stove to retain the heat overnight. She traded a second set of drafting plans to a local farmer for 2 thick wool blankets. She walked to the general store with a third set of completed architectural drawings. The owner traded her a box of sharp graphite pencils and a heavy metal ruler. He also traded 3 brass battery-powered lanterns and large glass jars of preserved peaches. Helen carried the heavy supplies the 3 miles back to the bunker without stopping to rest. She organized her new pantry on a sturdy wooden shelf she built into the stone. She hung the heavy brass lanterns from the exposed steel ceiling beams. Helen still needed a proper surface to work on the corporate documents. She returned to the abandoned logging camp the following morning. She found a massive, solid oak door resting off its rusted hinges in the freezing mud. She spent 6 hours dragging the heavy wood through the dense brush. Her muscles cramped violently in the freezing afternoon air. She used her heavy navy wool coat as a sled to pull the oak over the rough stones. She managed to lower the massive door down the bunker hatch using a thick braided rope. She salvaged 4 thick steel pipes from the abandoned mill site. She used the heavy pipes to construct a sturdy, perfectly level desk frame. She placed the heavy oak door on top of the steel supports. She spent 2 entire days sanding the rough wood by hand with broken glass. She rubbed natural linseed oil into the oak until the deep grain shone brightly. She had built a massive drafting table in the exact center of the bunker. One evening, Helen stood at the base of the iron ladder and looked across the room. The cast-iron stove glowed bright orange in the dim space. The warm light from the brass lanterns reflected off the rich red grain of the cedar floorboards. The scruffy dog lay stretched out completely flat on a thick woven rug near the fire. It was not shivering. The heavy brass compass rested on the polished oak table, pointing steadily north. The cold grey hole was gone. Helen sat at the massive oak drafting table in the center of the bunker. The cast-iron stove radiated a steady, deep heat against her back. She placed the original corporate deeds in a neat stack on the polished wood. She placed the thin manila folder Richard had given her right beside them. The folder had held the single sheet of paper banishing her to these woods. Helen picked up the empty manila folder. She walked over to the heavy black stove and opened the iron grate. She tossed the folder directly into the bright orange coals. She watched the thick paper curl, blacken, and turn completely to white ash. She did not think about Richard's custom navy suit or his polished mahogany table. She thought about the exact weight of her own calloused hands. She returned to the oak table and placed her palm flat against the wood. She reached up and touched the heavy brass compass hanging from her neck. "You built the foundation, Dad," Helen said to the quiet room. "I just finally learned how to stand on it." A sudden, distinct physical shift moved through her body. The tight, burning knot that had lived behind her ribs for 38 years dissolved. Her jaw unclenched, and her shoulders dropped a full inch. She breathed in the smell of cedar and wood smoke, without any restriction. It was enough. The next morning, Helen heard the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel road. She climbed the iron ladder and pushed the rusted steel hatch open. Marcus stood in the clearing beside his battered pickup truck. He was not alone. The owner of the general store stood beside him, holding a wooden crate. A local dairy farmer stood near the tailgate with a large metal tin. They did not knock on the open hatch or announce their arrival loudly. They walked down the steep iron steps into the warm, cedar-lined room. They looked at the massive oak drafting table and the glowing iron stove. The store owner set the wooden crate gently on the polished oak surface. It contained a dozen fresh eggs, 2 loaves of bread, and a bag of dark coffee. The farmer placed the heavy metal tin of fresh milk on the stone hearth. Marcus pulled a rolled sheet of drafting vellum from his thick canvas jacket. "The hardware store in town needs a new roof structure," Marcus said. "The owner saw what you drew for my garage expansion." Helen unrolled the vellum and pinned the corners flat against the heavy oak. She picked up a sharp graphite pencil and a silver T-square. The 3 men pulled up salvaged wooden crates and sat around the fire. The general store owner poured hot coffee into 4 mismatched ceramic mugs. Nobody asked Helen about the legal eviction or the massive corporate estate. They asked her about the load-bearing capacity of heavy timber trusses. They asked her how to properly grade a sloped drainage ditch. The farmer talked about his grandfather, who used to trade tools with Arthur Vance. Marcus talked about the exact year the logging camp had shut its doors. Helen drew precise, sharp lines across the thick drafting paper as they spoke. The bunker was no longer a cold, isolated hole in the ground. It was a warm room filled with the smell of fresh coffee and damp wool. Word spread quickly through the small, forgotten logging town. People began arriving at the bunker every few days without formal invitations. A retired schoolteacher brought a stack of worn architectural history books. A young carpenter brought a bundle of sanded cherry wood scraps. They came because they recognized the quiet strength of the woman working inside. Helen never asked for charity, and they never offered it. She traded her exact, mathematical structural designs for heavy winter supplies. She drafted a new greenhouse layout for the dairy farmer's wife. She designed a reinforced concrete retaining wall for the general store's loading dock. She calculated the exact water pressure for a new irrigation system. She drew every single line by hand, using only her graphite pencil and the heavy metal ruler. The townspeople paid her in cords of split firewood, thick wool blankets, and fresh produce. They respected the absolute precision of her rigorous work. They respected the quiet way she handled the tools of her trade. She created a space where people brought their problems and left with solid blueprints. The scruffy dog greeted every visitor with a slow wag of its heavy tail. Helen sat at the center of the room with graphite dust on her fingers. She wore her heavy navy wool coat draped over the back of her chair. The heavy brass compass rested flat on the drafting table beside her tools. She looked at the precise lines she had drawn with her own 2 hands. She realized she no longer needed a single thing from the man who discarded her. A sleek black town car scraped its expensive undercarriage against the frozen logging road. The heavy vehicle parked exactly where Helen's sedan had stopped months ago. Helen heard the distinct crunch of heavy tires over the steady crackle of her cast-iron stove. The scruffy dog stood up from the woven rug and issued a low, sustained growl. Helen set her graphite pencil down on the heavy oak drafting table. She wiped her dusty fingers on the thick canvas of her trousers. She did not rush to the iron ladder. She calmly poured a cup of dark coffee from the metal tin on the stove. Heavy footsteps sounded against the concrete slab above. The rusted steel hatch swung open, casting a square of bright grey light onto the cedar floor. Richard descended the steep iron ladder first. He wore a long, tailored cashmere coat and pristine leather shoes. His lead attorney followed closely behind, clutching a slim leather briefcase. Richard stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked around the warm, brightly lit room. He stared at the massive oak desk, the polished brass lanterns, and the stacked cedar floorboards. He looked at Helen standing calmly by the fire, in her weathered leather boots. "We've been so worried about you, Helen," Richard said smoothly. He stepped forward, brushing a speck of dust from his expensive cashmere sleeve. "Living out here in the dirt like this is completely unreasonable." He adopted his practiced mask of deep, paternal concern. "At your age, you simply cannot manage alone in the woods." Helen took a slow sip of her hot coffee. "You came a long way to check on my living conditions, Richard," she said quietly. The attorney opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Richard cleared his throat and gestured to the document. "We are finalizing the sale of the downtown commercial plaza," Richard said. The bank flagged an old clerical error regarding the initial seed capital. He smiled a tight, polished smile that did not reach his eyes. "We just need a simple signature to clear the title and finalize the paperwork." He pushed the paper onto the edge of the oak drafting table. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Richard added softly. "You shouldn't complicate my legacy over a company where you were essentially just the help." Helen reached up and rested her hand over the heavy brass compass at her chest. She looked at the man she had pulled from absolute financial ruin 38 years ago. She set her ceramic mug down on the heavy oak wood. She reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She did not hand the envelope to Richard. She handed it directly to the lead attorney. "Those are photocopies," Helen stated plainly. "The originals are stored in a secure deposit box at the county bank." The attorney pulled the thick stack of papers from the envelope. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and read the top page. He stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. He quickly flipped to the second page, his eyes darting across the thick black ink. The color completely drained from the attorney's face. He looked up at Richard, his hands trembling slightly against the crisp paper. "Richard," the attorney whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room, "these are the original founding deeds." Richard stepped forward and snatched the papers from the lawyer's hands. He stared at the unalterable legal proof of his massive corporate fraud. He stared at the documents showing his entire empire was legally seeded strictly in Helen's name. Helen did not shout. She did not offer a dramatic speech about justice or revenge. She stood perfectly still in her heavy navy wool coat. "You hid my father's trust capital for 38 years, Helen said evenly. "You forged the corporate ownership records to legally erase me." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He dropped his expensive silver pen onto the cedar floor. "You exiled me to a plot of land you thought was worthless," Helen continued, "because you thought I was worthless." She stepped toward the iron ladder and pointed up at the open hatch. "You were wrong about both." Richard looked at the photocopied deeds, his hands shaking violently. He looked at the woman who had built his foundation and who now held the power to destroy it. He dropped the papers onto the drafting table. He turned and climbed the iron ladder without saying a single word. The attorney scrambled up the steps immediately after him. Helen watched their expensive shoes disappear into the grey light. The heavy door clicked shut above her. 6 months later, the morning air over the ridge was warm. Helen stood inside a new timber-framed studio built directly over the open bunker hatch. Marcus and the young local carpenter had helped her raise the heavy cedar beams. They had worked together through the early weeks of spring. Sunlight poured through a massive, south-facing glass window she had salvaged from the old mill. The scruffy dog lay completely flat in a wide square of warm light on the floorboards. His torn ear twitched slightly as he slept in the quiet room. Helen wore her faded canvas trousers and a light cotton shirt. She had rolled the sleeves up past her elbows. Her heavy navy wool coat hung permanently on an iron hook beside the wooden door. She stood at the massive oak drafting table in the center of the bright room. She held a freshly sharpened graphite pencil in her calloused right hand. She was drafting the final structural blueprints for the logging town's new community center. A folded copy of the city's daily financial newspaper rested on a small wooden stool nearby. The front page featured a large, stark photograph of Richard. He was walking down the stone steps of a federal courthouse, flanked by defense attorneys. The bold black headline announced the absolute liquidation of Vance Development. It detailed the federal freezing of his $80.7 million estate. It listed the multiple pending indictments for decades of offshore corporate embezzlement. Helen did not read the dense article printed below the headline. She picked up the newspaper, opened the door of the cast-iron stove, and dropped it inside. She watched the black ink and the photograph curl into fragile white ash. She closed the heavy iron grate and walked back to her drafting table. The original trust capital her father had hidden was now fully recovered and legally hers. She had transferred the entire sum into a municipal development fund for the local town. She picked up her heavy metal ruler and pressed it flat against the thick vellum. She drew a perfectly straight horizontal line for the new building's foundation. Her hand did not tremble at all. She reached to the top right corner of the heavy oak desk. She picked up the heavy brass compass. The braided leather cord wrapped loosely around her strong, weathered fingers. She looked through the thick, perfectly clear glass face of the instrument. The brass casing caught the bright morning sunlight and gleamed. The thin metal needle hovered for a fraction of a second. Then it settled, pointing steadily and completely true north. She no longer needed it to navigate the freezing, dark woods. She set the heavy brass compass down gently on the bottom right corner of the blueprint. It served as a perfect, unmovable weight to hold the paper flat against the wood. Helen looked at the precise, clean lines she had drafted with her own two hands. She traced the deep, beautiful grain of the polished oak table with her thumb. "We finally built it right, Dad," Helen said to the quiet room. "The absolute truth about foundations is that they cannot be stolen. A man can forge legal documents and hide stolen capital in offshore accounts. He can use expensive lawyers and custom navy suits to build an empire of paper. He can convince the entire city that he is the sole architect of his massive success. But paper is incredibly fragile, and lies require constant, exhausting maintenance. Real strength is poured by hand in the freezing dark." Helen Vance spent 38 years quietly building a fortune for a man who discarded her. She gave up her own architectural license to ensure his financial survival. She raised his children and balanced his ledgers without ever drawing a single salary. When he legally exiled her to a frozen patch of woodland, he thought she would simply disappear. He thought a forgotten Cold War bunker was just a worthless hole in the dirt. He did not understand that some structures are explicitly designed to withstand the end of the world. Helen's world ended in that sterile downtown legal office, but she carried her father's heavy brass compass straight into the absolute dark. She used her own calloused hands to scrape away the thick rust and the deep lies. She built a warm, brightly lit sanctuary out of salvaged cedar and quiet defiance. She reclaimed her family's stolen legacy without ever raising her voice in anger. She destroyed a towering empire of greed using a single stack of dry paper. When she was left with exactly $41.16, she did not shatter. She did not wait for an apology from people incapable of genuine remorse. She simply went into the freezing earth and rebuilt her life entirely on her own terms. She proved that the person who knows how to draft the true blueprints will always survive the storm. The architect will always outlast the thief. The universe eventually strips away everything that is false and hollow. It leaves only what is solid, tested, and genuinely true. If Helen's story moved you, if you've ever watched someone take credit for your quiet labor and long sacrifices, leave one word in the comments describing the exact moment she handed those photocopied deeds across the oak table. Because Helen's story proves something that is always true. The strength you build while serving others is never wasted. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it is never too late to reclaim your foundation, because together we prove that dreams don't age.